Nosemonkey, you mentioned that there's a lot of lack of personalities in the EU. Could there be sort of, is this because of British practice, or is it because of the EU? And should the sort of news about the EU be more focused on policy or personalities?
Well, I'm a policy geek, so I'd say policy, but that's basically nobody's interested in policy at all. When was the last time you saw policy discussions in detail in the British press? I mean, we've had bits and pieces about the student tuition fees and all this sort of stuff the last couple of days, but what they're focusing on is some kids smashing up police vans. They don't care about the policy. It's all, you know, headline £9,000 tuition fee rise, supposedly, and it's all a lot more complicated than that. And this is an important issue for this country, which is being dealt with in the newspapers. I mean, all the papers, they've got pages and pages on this to actually find out what this policy is all about. It's really very, very hard. You have to dig through a whole load of crap about teenagers getting a bit overexcited and policemen being useless. It's rubbish, and the EU is, as everyone's here saying, to find out what an EU policy is actually about, you have to dig your way down into the depths of the Europa site, to dig out a PDF, read your way through a whole load of legal jargon, which even the people who wrote it probably don't understand, and find out somewhere deep down in paragraph 570 part 2 that there's some very, very boring phrase that's been misinterpreted by somebody which could mean that Christmas crackers are banned or something. And you know, it's very hard. So unless you've got a personality, you can come out and actually engage people to explain why this is complete nonsense. All you're going to get is the Nigel Farages of this world popping up on Newsnight because they're entertaining and they're quite happy to get overexcited about trivial things. And you're never going to get anybody countering it because it's very hard to be entertaining about the EU. I've tried, and it's really very hard because it's just so boring. And you have to understand so many deeply complicated legal and economic bits and pieces. It's a nightmare. So yeah, nobody can understand, nobody can make it interesting, so you're a bit screwed. And then you get your Farages coming along, making up statistics and sounding entertaining like some old duff that you meet down the pub. You know, a bit of a Boris Johnson type thing. It's fun, which is why the Eurosceptics can sell themselves so much.
We have a question. Yeah, go ahead.
Is Europe viewed the same way outside the UK, or is it just our view? Because you're describing a Europe that is outside the UK is really liked and really appreciated to some extent, but we here seem to think it's just a waste of space. Which I agree, I think it is a waste of space. But I'm just trying to be devil's advocate here. Is it our attitude to Europe, or is it actually Europe itself?
Okay. You can briefly answer this, but we're just going to get a question after the Q&A.
Well, can I just jump in and say two quick things, because I have to keep very soon. One is, in response to that, no, clearly not. A lot of the continental coverage of the European Union is equally very sketchy. People don't understand it either in countries that, you know, a lot of the press coverage is not very good, but it's seen as essentially a kind of moral project because the alternative is nationalism. And I think a kind of a good analogy is it's the way that people here debate, say, for example, overseas development aid. They may be aware that there's problems with it, but fundamentally it's seen as a kind of decent activity, sort of decent form of spending. That's one part. The other thing is I just want to say I think that Nosemonkey is right about the way that the institutions are, that they're boring and hard to understand, and that what they do is often boring and important. But I think there's a very important problem, which is that Europe as a whole, particularly say this Eurozone crisis, this is very serious stuff, which has enormously important consequences for the British economy. And I think there really is something dangerous going on in the way that we cover this so badly, in the way that the possibility of a default in Spain is written up in so many British newspapers as, you know, bring it on, let's see the euro go smash, wouldn't that be good news? As opposed to any analysis of the degree to which British banks cross over as Spanish banks. Why is there a Santander on the high street? What might that mean? The fact that the Spanish own our airports, the fact that there's enormous holdings of Spanish sovereign debt by British banks, what that would actually mean. It's that failure to examine things that are actually not boring at all, but really, really important. That kind of childish, babyish kind of schadenfreude that replaces proper news coverage. It's actually really dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, David, but I wonder how much schadenfreude have you really seen in the analysis on the euro crisis? I mean, if anything, when the Tory backbenchers came out against an Irish bailout, they experienced a bit of a backlash. precisely because people realize that, look, this situation is pretty scary. You know, we can sit here, we can criticize, and we can talk about inherent flaws in the Eurozone, but at the end of the day, again, this is our bank, this is our economy. So I think on that point, you're a bit wrong.
I can point you to columns in the Daily Mail, in the Daily Telegraph, in the Daily Express, saying the collapse of the euro would be a good thing.
Well, I'm not. Some of us might think that's true. So,
I think it's a separate.
Your opinion.
I hope you don't have any money in any bank in.
But
your opinion.
Matt's
It's a good thing. My opinion is it's a bad thing. So, just because you disagree with Daily Mail journalists doesn't make you right.
No, I'd be right.
Can this be a serious
right,
discussion? Apart from David Rennie, it's nonsense. I mean, complete bloody nonsense. David Rennie's talking serious. It's like Big Brother or something on this. I mean, it's quite extraordinary level of nonsense being spoken. David's talking. I mean, can't we have a serious debate about this?
What's your point? Understanding.
Well, my point is perfectly clear. It would be perfectly reasonable if one was having an intelligent debate about the problems of the EU and how the media deals with those problems. We all know that Murdoch and Dacre and Desmond lie. We know that, all of us. Anybody who's had to do with those papers. It's absurd to say, maybe Van Rompuy should be chosen after a Big Brother contest or something.
Q&A
It's just a joke.
Paul, did you want to have something further to say on that?
Well, I was going to say on the point about the media the media coverage of the European Union in different countries. I mean, that is a really interesting discussion, which I think needs to be had. And I think the British media could learn a thing or two from some other European countries on how to cover the media. I mean, that's true. It's true. I mean, it's just, if you look at the German coverage, for instance, it tends to be increasingly skeptical, but it also sometimes digs into the detail much more than what we see in the British media. And I think and I agree with you on that point, David, on the Eurozone crisis in particular, because of such sensitive information out there and so forth, and the stakes are so high. It's vitally important to really give the readership the details that they require in order to make an informed decision. But it doesn't mean that the German media is less critical of of certain aspects of the problem. It just means that they give a different set of information and details about it.
I just add, especially when it comes to the Eurozone, and a lot of what the EU does is obviously economic policy. And if you read economic coverage in most newspapers in most countries, it's not very good, because most journalists don't have any economic training, they don't really understand it. So that's why I think a lot of the time you don't get much coverage of Eurozone issues, and the Eurozone crisis put into this sort of artificial black and white sort of, is it going to collapse, is it not, which in turn then scares the markets and all the rest of it and actually fuels the crisis. It's because people don't understand. I mean, I've been doing bits and pieces of stuff in the sort of professional world, this sort of hacker type journalistic thing, and I can't pretend to be an economic journalist at all. I remember when we had the whole global financial crisis thing kicking off a few years ago, we were told, oh right, brilliant, just put that on the front page, that'll sell, it scares people. And that's the thing, it's like, this is a scary thing, so let's emphasise the scariness of it, because we don't really understand the details, no one's interested in the details, they're interested in the scare headline.
Paul?
Despite my accent, I'm actually an Irish citizen, and up until a couple of months ago, the Irish press and the political class was stavishly Europhile. The Irish Times read like a press release from the EU every day. Now, all of a sudden, you've got a more realistic and more detailed coverage of the EU only in the last couple of months. So it cuts both ways. If you're complaining about a shallow interpretation of EU affairs, there are shallow interpretations that are stavishly pro-EU as well.
I mean, I think it does take a crisis for people to start treating it seriously. If you take like the French press in the run-up to their constitutional referendum a few years back, suddenly you had serious analysis, serious discussion going on, which hadn't really been present before, because it's not news, no one's interested. We haven't really had a proper EU-related crisis in the UK yet. And if one does happen, then we might finally start seeing some more intelligent coverage. But, if we actually want that to happen.
I'll take questions after the Q&A.